When you turn on the news today and see the headlines about the crisis in Haiti, the images paint a very specific picture.
Yeah, they really do. It looks like just total anarchy.
Exactly. It looks like a sudden explosion of pure, unadulterated chaos, right?
Mhm.
Like this kind of random, unpredictable violence that just, I don't know, bubbles up out of nowhere to swallow a country whole.
Right, you see heavily armed groups controlling the streets, and it just feels like a complete breakdown of logic.
Yeah, it creates the illusion of complete anarchy, as if there is no underlying structure to what's happening at all. But, I mean, the reality is actually far more complex and, well, structured,
Incredibly structured, yeah.
which is exactly what we discovered when going through the source material for today. If you look closely at the data, the timelines, and the internal documents from the last 20 years, that perception of sudden random chaos is just, it's completely wrong.
Totally wrong.
What we're actually looking at is the result of a decades-long, incredibly high-stakes game of tactical chess between law enforcement and criminal organizations. I mean, how did street-level thugs in 2004 manage to outsmart the police, infiltrate the national banking system, and ultimately become a cartel that taxes an entire nation?
That is the big mystery we're solving today.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to trace this evolution from 2004 to the present day and uncover how the literal, physical layout of a city can completely dictate its political destiny.
And my role here will be to unpack the mechanisms behind these shifts. We're going to look at the cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation, because every single time the Haitian police implemented a new strategy, the armed groups responded with a tactical counter-move, and vice versa.
It's a terrifying but fascinating study in criminal evolution, honestly. And to you listening right now, I promise that by the end of this deep dive, you will understand the mechanics of this crisis in a way that headline news rarely captures.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this. The starting board for this chess match is 2004. The Haitian government has just fallen.
Right, a major transition period.
Exactly. And the police are suddenly faced with an escalating crisis of street-level bandits robbing and terrorizing citizens. So they try the most standard law enforcement playbook imaginable, right? They put uniformed officers on key cross streets and establish fixed, predictable patrol routes.
Which is what you do, right?
Sure, but the source notes it's failed almost immediately.
Yeah, it failed because traditional policing relies on the assumption that the criminal element is disorganized. The police were treating it like a standard crime wave, but the bandits were treating it like a sophisticated game of surveillance.
Wait, so they were actually watching the cops?
Oh, intensely. They didn't just hide from the police, they actively studied them. The armed groups set up these extensive networks of lookouts to track police rotations. Yeah, they mapped out exactly when shifts were changing, when an intersection post was temporarily empty, or, when a specific patrol route was understaffed. And remember, the police force was experiencing massive retention issues at the time.
Right, the police were just bleeding personnel, and the gangs knew exactly where the gaps were. So the police realized sitting at fixed intersections in uniform just makes them sitting ducks.
Exactly, so they pivot.
Yeah, they pull the uniforms off the streets entirely and deploy plainclothes officers in private vehicles. So the strategy shifts from a show of force to secret surveillance. And initially, this actually secures the main arterial roads.
It does, for a brief moment. But then the bandits countermove.
Right.
Since they can't travel in small groups without getting picked off by plainclothes cops, they start moving in massive, heavily armed convoys. They travel together for protection, and the second they breach downtown Port-au-Prince, they suddenly split up in every possible direction.
And what's fascinating there is just the sheer logistical brilliance of that countermove.
Yeah.
By moving as a small army, they deter the plainclothes officers from engaging at all.
Exactly. You're not going to pull over an army.
Right, and by dispersing instantly upon entering the dense downtown area, they overwhelm the communication and tracking capabilities of the police. It's like, well, it's the ultimate scatter drill in sports.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah.
If you have your defense set up perfectly, but suddenly the offense scatters in 20 different directions down a labyrinth of side streets, your traditional defense mechanisms become completely useless. You simply don't have the manpower to chase every single threat.
You really don't.
But, that leads to the obvious question. Why not just track them back to their home base? Like, why didn't the police just send tactical SWAT teams into the neighborhoods where these bandits lived and shut them down at the source?
The answer to that lies entirely in the physical environment. The urban terrain completely negated traditional tactical raids.
Because of how it was built.
Right. These neighborhoods were not formally zoned or properly built at all. Our source describes them as chaotic constructions. We are talking about thousands of houses made of sheet metal, cinder blocks, and cardboard, just built haphazardly right on top of each other.
Meaning there were literally no roads.
None. There is no grid system. There's absolutely no way for armored vehicles to drive in and reinforce lawful forces.
That's insane.
In many of these sprawling slums, there isn't even enough space between the structures for two people to walk shoulder to shoulder.
Oh, wow. So you can't even march a squad in there.
Exactly. If a tactical team of uniformed police officers tried to navigate that labyrinth on foot, they would be funneled into fatal choke points. They would be exposed to invisible snipers shooting from behind walls of corrugated iron with no way to identify where the bullets were coming from.
And no way to call for a rapid extraction either. So the architecture itself was basically weaponized against law enforcement. Fixed patrols are out, car surveillance is out, and tactical raids are physically impossible. So to solve this in 2004, the Haitian police execute a move that is honestly staggering.
It really is wild.
They decide to go fully deep cover. They send plainclothes agents to actually rent apartments and live deep inside these chaotic neighborhoods.
Just coexisting in the exact same cramped, dangerous conditions as the bandits themselves.
Yeah. I mean, the psychological and physical risk for those officers is just immense. But the intelligence payoff was unprecedented. The police effectively established a large-scale command and control intelligence network for the inside out.
Which was the only way to beat that terrain.
Right. The undercover cops living in those sheet metal structures could observe everything. They noted exactly which alleyways the convoys were launching from, the exact times they mobilized, and the specific routes they took to execute that downtown scatter drill.
And with that granular inside knowledge, the police finally stopped reacting and started anticipating.
Exactly. They set traps along those specific exit routes, ambushed the convoys, and caught large numbers of bandits. They completely dismantled those initial street-level networks.
Which is a massive tactical victory, obviously, but it triggers the next evolution of the crisis.
Right, because nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. When you shut down the primary revenue stream for a criminal enterprise, they don't simply retire. The street-level banditry became far too dangerous, so the surviving criminal elements had to pivot to a new, higher-yield business model.
And that forced pivot launched a terrifying new era for Haiti, right?
Yeah.
The kidnapping epidemic of 2005 and 2006.
Yes.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the police investigation into these kidnappings uncovered something that sounds like it belongs in a spy thriller.
It really does.
The uniformed police, now operating under a restructured leadership, start meticulously interviewing the kidnapping victims and their families. They're looking for a common denominator, and the pattern that emerges is incredibly specific.
Very specific. The victims were exclusively people who had just deposited or withdrawn huge sums of money from banks.
Right, and the threshold the kidnappers were using was exact. They targeted anyone moving the equivalent of $10,000 or more in Haitian currency, or absolutely any customer making a transaction in American dollars, regardless of the amount.
Which is a huge red flag.
I mean, think about the logistics of that for a second. You have street-level gang members somehow accessing real-time, high-level ledger data from national banks. How is that physically happening? You don't just guess that someone walked out of a bank with 10 grand in a briefcase.
No, you don't. You need a sophisticated inside source. The police recognized that the intelligence gathering had flipped with. The criminals now had eyes inside the legitimate institutions.
So how do they catch them?
Well, to prove it, law enforcement executed a countermove that basically mirrored their successful slum strategy. They figured if they could infiltrate the chaotic neighborhoods, they could infiltrate the financial sector.
Oh my God.
Yeah, they sent undercover officers to work inside the banks.
Wait, so the police are posing as bank employees?
Yes. They are operating right alongside the tellers and the directors, and their mission was essentially a massive lifestyle audit. These undercover officers monitored the bank directors and senior employees, carefully observing their spending habits.
Just watching what they buy.
Exactly. They started cross-referencing the luxury vehicles these directors drove to work and the real estate they were purchasing against their actual on-the-books banking salaries.
And I'm guessing the math didn't even come close to adding up.
It was a glaring discrepancy. The police concluded definitively that these banking professionals were not just being coerced, they were active, willing participants in the kidnapping networks.
That is wild. So the bank directors themselves were mandating that their tellers report any large transactions, and then the directors would just pass that real-time data directly to the kidnappers, likely taking a massive cut of the ransom.
Oh, undoubtedly.
But once the police secured this evidence, the uniformed units swept in and executed mass arrests directly inside the financial institutions.
Right on the banking floor.
And the domino effect was instantaneous. The moment those wealthy bank employees were in handcuffs, facing serious prison time in Haiti, they flipped. They traded information for leniency, detailing exactly which bandit groups they were feeding data to and exactly where those criminal groups held their meetings.
And that gave the police everything they needed.
Exactly. The police raided those locations, arrested the kidnappers, and successfully severed the head of the financial snake.
Which is a brilliant operation, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that recurring theme again: victory creates a vacuum.
Right.
Shutting down the centralized bank-funded kidnapping rings didn't eliminate the crime of kidnapping, it simply decentralized it. The criminal landscape fractured. Without the sophisticated, reliable intelligence coming from bank directors, the large syndicates broke apart into smaller, detached gangs.
So we enter the era of the small-time crew. These were smaller groups with a handful of weapons and zero major corporate connections. To find targets, they had to rely on intimate networks. Tips from friends, neighbors, or family members who had personal knowledge of a victim's finances. It was a much more dispersed, localized threat.
And this transition introduces a completely new hurdle for law enforcement, which was the technological war.
Oh, right, the phones.
Yeah. These new, decentralized crews adopted a tool that made them virtually invisible: burner phones. They utilized unassigned and unregistered SIM cards to negotiate the ransoms.
Yeah.
And the moment the money was dropped, they discarded the SIM card, completely erasing their digital footprint.
Which is a nightmare to track. And the police initially tried to treat this like a standard supply chain issue, right? Like they would capture a low-level bandit, interrogate them about where they purchased the SIM card, and then go arrest the street vendor.
Right, but trying to arrest individual street vendors was like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon.
Right. The sheer volume of unregistered SIMs flooding the market was just overwhelming.
It really raises an important question, right? What does law enforcement do when the legal framework of a country actually enables the criminal?
It's a massive problem.
So the Haitian police realized that they couldn't arrest their way out of a telecommunications loophole. They needed to change the rules of the game entirely, so they escalated the fight to the legislative level.
I mean, the desperation of the police force here is just incredible. They are losing the battle on the streets, so police commanders actually go and testify before the Haitian parliament.
Yes.
They demand that the government rewrite national telecommunications laws. They force a mandate requiring the revocation of operating licenses for any major telecom company that refuses to report to the police.
They went after the suppliers, yeah.
They target the sub-suppliers too, demanding their licenses be pulled if they sell a SIM card without legally recording the identity of the customer. They even legally compelled the major telecom companies to immediately suspend any branch or vendor that activated a phone without proper documentation.
It was a monumental bureaucratic crackdown. I mean, effectively forcing the corporate sector to police its own supply chain under threat of dissolution.
Right, and it worked to stop the bleeding, right? The influx of new, untraceable SIM cards plummeted.
It did. But, as the source points out, legislation is inherently forward-looking. It stops tomorrow's burner phones, but it does absolutely nothing about the massive backlog of unregistered SIM cards already active in the hands of kidnappers.
Right, so to solve the backlog, the police had to rely on pure geometry.
Geometry, exactly.
With the new laws in place, the telecom companies were finally cooperating. So whenever an unregistered phone was used to make a ransom demand, the telecom companies would use cell tower data to triangulate the signal in real time.
Just pinpointing them on a map?
Yeah, and they fed those exact coordinates to the police. That geometric data allowed tactical units to stake out key locations, surveil the designated drop points for the ransom money, and coordinate rapid ambushes before the kidnappers could vanish.
And through this massive coordinated technological dragnet, the kidnapping rate dropped to a negligible number.
It was a profound triumph of adaptation. The police systematically dismantled every iteration of the criminal networks.
They really did.
Which honestly makes the next part of our timeline deeply unsettling. Because if you're listening to this, you are probably putting the pieces together and realizing a massive contradiction.
Yeah, there's a big disconnect.
The police beat the street gangs with undercover apartment stings. They beat the bank cartels by infiltrating the financial sector. They beat the decentralized kidnappers by literally rewriting national telecom laws and weaponizing cell tower triangulation. They won every major tactical battle.
They won them all.
So How did we arrive at the unprecedented nation-collapsing crisis that Haiti is facing today? I mean, if they won, why is it so bad now?
Well, the source material identifies a specific catalyst for the current nightmare. And it wasn't a failure of police tactics, but rather a combination of two massive societal shifts that occurred while the police were fighting those isolated battles.
Okay, what were they?
First, those chaotic constructions we discussed earlier, the slums with zero infrastructure, they grew at an exponential rate. What began as small, difficult-to-navigate neighborhoods expanded into massive, impenetrable territories. The physical shield protecting the criminals grew larger.
Wow, okay.
And second, and arguably more devastating, was a profound level of political and corporate interference.
Okay, we need to pause on this and be explicitly clear on this point because we are maintaining strict impartiality here as we report exactly what the text outlines. We're not taking sides, just sharing what the documents say.
Absolutely.
The source notes that this interference was not isolated to one faction. It came from across the entire spectrum of power. According to the text, guns were systematically distributed into these neighborhoods by government politicians during election campaigns to secure power. But simultaneously, opposition politicians paid these armed groups to block streets, shoot indiscriminately, and shut down national traffic to force political concessions from the government. Furthermore, the text notes that private businessmen began paying these armed groups to physically eliminate their commercial competitors.
Yeah, and this injection of high-level capital and military-grade weaponry fundamentally altered the DNA of the armed groups. They were no longer street-level bandits or localized kidnappers struggling for resources.
We evolved.
Exactly. They evolved into heavily armed mercenary factions, essentially operating as private armies available for contract to the highest bidder, whether that was a corporate CEO or a political leader.
The evolution basically mirrors corporate mergers and acquisitions perfectly.
Right.
I mean, in the beginning of this new phase, you had dozens of scattered, divided mercenary groups violently fighting each other to win these lucrative contracts from the elites.
Fighting for the scraps.
But eventually, they undergo a paradigm shift. They look at the map and realize that expanding their physical territory, taking over entire communes, which are essentially the size of counties, makes them infinitely more powerful than the people paying them.
Because territory equates to economic control. The source emphasizes that the previous generation of bandits died because they allowed themselves to be used as pawns, killing each other over paid hits.
Right, doing the dirty work.
Yeah. But the new generation realized that if they simply monopolized the physical geography of the country, they wouldn't have to bleed for a politician's paycheck anymore. They could just control the economy itself.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah.
And this realization leads to the formation of what we can call the Big Three in this corporate era of gangs. First, you have the G9 coalition, which the source describes as originally functioning as the government's contract killers and fixers.
Okay.
On the other side, you have GPep, which the text identifies as the opposition's affiliated armed group. These two massive, heavily armed coalitions basically plunge the country into a brutal, prolonged civil war, fighting commune against commune for territorial dominance.
But the conflict eventually culminates in the ultimate terrifying merger. After years of civil war, the leadership of G9 and GPep arrive at a mutual conclusion: their political bosses are obsolete.
They just don't need them anymore.
Exactly. They don't need the opposition leaders, and they don't need the corporate businessmen. So the two warring factions merge into a single, overwhelming super coalition known as Ansanm, which translates to living together.
And Vigilantes is the monopoly that dominates the landscape today. And their business model has moved entirely past petty crime or contract killing. It is pure, unfiltered extortion on a macroeconomic scale. They don't need to hunt for victims anymore. They simply tax existence.
Yeah, they impose rigid tolls on the national highways. They dictate terms to the legitimate economy, requiring businesses across every sector, food distribution, banking, oil, gas, to pay monthly existence fees in U.S. dollars.
So if you are a logistics company driving a truck carrying merchandise, you are paying a cartel toll and a premium fee just for the right to drive on the road. Ansanm has effectively replaced the state's tax collection apparatus with a nationwide extortion racket.
Which fundamentally hollows out the authority of the state. When the government is completely incapable of protecting its citizens from an invading force because Ansanm operates as a sovereign entity, a vacuum is created.
Right.
And the citizens who live outside of the conquered territories will inevitably react to fill that vacuum.
And this leads us to the rise of the Autodefense or vigilante groups. The citizens who haven't been swallowed by the cartel are arming themselves and fighting back. Now, on the surface, you look at that and think, wait, aren't the citizens defending themselves the good guys here? They are standing up to a cartel that taxes their food and gas.
It is an entirely natural human reaction to a failing state. But the tragic reality detailed in our source material is that vigilantism, without state oversight, quickly mirrors the disease it is trying to cure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
These autodefense groups operate in a space of total impunity. They become the judge, jury, and executioner in their own neighborhoods. And the tragedy outlined in the text is that they have begun adopting the exact same tactics as the cartels they are fighting.
Right. The source points out that these vigilante groups are now setting up their own roadblocks. They are asking citizens to pay tolls to pass through so-called protected territories. They openly challenge the authority of the actual police force.
And it feeds an endless, horrific cycle of violence. The text details how these auto-defense groups will frequently profile people, arbitrarily deciding that a stranger walking through their neighborhood is a gang collaborator, and they will just execute them on the spot.
And Ansanm doesn't just let that go, do they?
No, not at all. When a suspected gang member is killed by vigilantes, the cartel retaliates with overwhelming force. But because the armed vigilantes are hard to track down, Ansanm directs their vengeance at the community itself.
So they punish everyone.
Exactly. They assault the opposite territories, burning houses to the ground and executing completely innocent civilians and family members to send a message. This scorched earth retaliation is what causes the massive waves of displacement, forcing thousands of innocent people to flee their homes. It is a perpetual engine of misery.
Faced with this level of systemic collapse, the source material forces us to evaluate the proposed solutions. The author notes that, theoretically, the police could dust off those memos from 2004. They could attempt to use undercover agents to infiltrate the neighborhoods again.
They could try, yeah.
But the scale makes that impossible now, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. The text is explicit that sending undercover officers into the gang-controlled areas is now entirely out of reach for law enforcement. We aren't talking about a few city blocks of chaotic construction anymore. Ansanm controls vast multi-department territories.
And to put that in perspective, a department in Haiti is roughly the equivalent of a U.S. state.
Right. You cannot rent a single undercover apartment and expect to dismantle a heavily armed syndicate that governs the territory of a state. The author suggests that undercover tactics might still be viable in the shrinking zones still under government control, purely as a defensive measure. But to reclaim the conquered zones, traditional policing is entirely obsolete.
So what does this all mean? If the police are structurally incapable of infiltrating these areas, and the gangs are operating as a corporate monopoly that taxes the entire economy, where does this end?
Well, the author's conclusion is grim and uncompromising. They argue that the Haitian government has fundamentally misdiagnosed the crisis. They are treating it as a massive crime wave, when in reality, the source insists this is a full-fledged civil war. And fighting a civil war requires the implementation of martial law, a step the government has hesitated to take.
So the core argument of the text is that this has evolved past a police problem. It is purely a military problem now. And the distinction between those two forces isn't just about the size of their guns, it's about their fundamental doctrine.
Exactly.
A police officer is a civilian who works a set shift. Their mandate, universally, is to serve and protect. They follow civilian laws of engagement.
But a soldier's doctrine is entirely different. A military force is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Their mandate is not to police a community, but to defend the state against an enemy force by any legal means necessary. And the text specifically notes that military doctrine explicitly includes the concept of destruction.
Destruction.
Yes. The author argues that Haiti requires its armed forces to engage in the systematic destruction of these mercenary monopolies because a police force is doctrinally incapable of fighting an occupying army.
But the brutal irony is that even if the military is fully deployed with a mandate for destruction, the source brings us right back to the very first obstacle we discussed from 2004. The root cause of this entire civil war, the shield that has allowed these gangs to survive every iteration of law enforcement for 2 decades, is the chaotic construction of the cities.
It all comes back to the slums.
The sheer lack of physical access, the absence of roads, the dense maze of sheet metal. It prevents armored vehicles and troops from entering the strongholds. The physical architecture is the ultimate defense.
It is.
The author concludes that while the problem is theoretically solvable, it requires confronting this geographic reality. and openly wonders if any political leadership has the fortitude to do what is necessary to rebuild the country from the ground up.
It really forces a completely different perspective on how we view national security.
It really does. So to synthesize this journey for you, we started in 2004 with what looked like a standard game of street-level cat and mouse. We watched cops hide in plain clothes and corrugated metal slums to break up convoys. We saw the gangs pivot to high-level kidnapping, only to be dismantled by undercover stings inside national banks and sweeping mandates that rewrote national telecom laws.
Right.
But because of high-level political and corporate interference, combined with the massive, unchecked expansion of inaccessible slums, those street criminals evolved. They morphed into heavily armed, corporate-style mercenaries. And today, they sit at the top of an extortion empire, locked in a civil war with vigilantes, while the state tries to determine if it needs police officers or an army to reclaim its sovereignty.
The evolution is staggering, and I think it leaves us with a deeply profound final thought to ponder.
Yeah.
We generally assume that law and order is purely a matter of policy, morality, or the size of a police force, We think if we just pass the right laws or hire enough officers, a society will be safe.
That's the assumption, yeah.
But looking at the last 20 years of Haiti's chaotic constructions, we have to ask a far more literal, physical question. How much of a society's political destiny, how much of its safety and its future is secretly dictated by the literal architecture of its streets? If you physically cannot build a road into a neighborhood, can you ever really build a state?
Wow. That is going to stay with me for a long time. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It is a complex world out there, but taking the time to truly unpack the sources helps us see the mechanics behind the headlines just a little more clearly. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.